"You don't belong here," the manager said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the polished silence of the lobby, and a split second later his hand made contact, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to freeze the entire room in place. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here." Now, back to Ethan Cole. The air inside the five-star hotel shifted instantly, like something invisible had cracked. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, the soft clinking of glassware faded, and every eye turned toward the man standing at the center of it all. Ethan Cole didn't move. Not immediately. He stood there in dark jeans, a simple charcoal shirt, and sneakers that looked more practical than expensive, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. There was no designer logo, no watch flashing under the chandelier light, nothing that matched the image the staff had been trained to respect. And that was the problem. The manager, tall, composed, and certain of his authority, adjusted his cuff as if nothing unusual had just happened, as if he had simply corrected a mistake in front of him. To him, Ethan was that mistake. A man who walked into a space reserved for a certain kind of presence, a certain kind of appearance, and failed the test before even speaking. "I said leave," he added, louder this time, making sure the room heard it, making sure the narrative belonged to him. Around them, guests shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the marble reception desk raised her phone slightly, hesitated, then lowered it again. A couple near the lounge exchanged glances, their silence louder than any protest. The staff behind the desk stood rigid, unsure whether to intervene or simply follow the tone their manager had already set. But Ethan Cole still didn't react. Not the way anyone expected. No raised voice. No defensive explanation. Just a slow, controlled breath, as if the moment unfolding in front of him was something he had already seen before. Because he had. Years ago, in a different lobby, under different lights, with different faces, but the same look. The same assumption. The same quiet dismissal that tried to reduce a man to what he appeared to be. Back then, he had walked away. Back then, he had nothing to prove. But this time, this wasn't just another place. This wasn't just another moment. The manager took a step closer, closing the distance with a confidence that came from never being questioned. "Security is on the way," he said, his tone colder now, more official, as if the situation had already been decided. A few heads nodded in agreement, not out of conviction, but out of habit. This was how things worked. This was how they had always worked. And still, Ethan Cole stood there, calm, grounded, almost anchored to the floor itself. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting the manager's for the first time, and in that brief exchange, something shifted, something subtle, but undeniable. Because in those eyes, there was no confusion. No fear. No hesitation. Just a quiet certainty that didn't match the role he had been assigned. And for the first time, the room didn't just see a man being told to leave. It felt like it was witnessing the beginning of something else entirely. The silence did not break, it stretched, heavy and deliberate, pressing against every polished surface in the lobby until even the chandeliers above seemed dimmer, as if the light itself was waiting to see what Ethan Cole would do next, and still he did nothing, not outwardly, not in the way the manager expected, because where there should have been reaction there was only control, measured and precise, the kind that did not come from weakness but from experience, the kind that had been built over years of being underestimated in rooms just like this one. And the longer he remained still the more uncomfortable the space became, because silence, when it refuses to submit, becomes something else entirely, it becomes pressure. The manager felt it even if he did not understand it, his jaw tightening slightly as he glanced around, noticing for the first time that the room was no longer fully on his side. A man near the entrance shifted his stance and frowned, a woman seated by the lounge table leaned forward, her voice low but clear enough to be heard, asking if that was really necessary, and that question alone cracked the illusion of control the manager had been holding on to, because now it was not just about authority, it was about being watched, judged, measured, and he did not like that, not one bit, so he doubled down, stepping forward again, closing the space between himself and Ethan with a confidence that felt more forced than before. "You are creating a disturbance," he said, louder now, shaping the narrative in real time, turning the room into a courtroom where he was both witness and judge. "This is a private property, and you have been asked to leave." The words landed, rehearsed, practiced, designed to sound official, designed to justify everything that had already happened. And yet something about them felt hollow now, like a script that no longer matched the scene unfolding in front of it, because Ethan Cole finally moved, not quickly, not aggressively, just enough to shift his weight, enough to show that he was not rooted there by fear but by choice, his gaze steady, his breathing even, and when he spoke his voice was calm, lower than the manager's but somehow carrying further, cutting through the tension without raising a single note. "A disturbance," he repeated, as if testing the word, as if deciding whether it deserved to exist in this moment. Then he let it fall, not arguing it, not rejecting it, simply refusing to give it power, and that refusal did something unexpected. It unsettled the people watching, because it forced them to question what they were seeing, whether the disturbance was really the man standing quietly in front of them or the voice trying so hard to remove him, and that question spread, subtle at first, then stronger. Like a current running through the room, a young man near the concierge desk lifted his phone again, this time not lowering it, not hesitating, recording openly, while another guest took a step closer, not intervening, but no longer distant either, and in the middle of it all the manager's certainty began to crack, just slightly, just enough to show, because control relies on belief, and belief was starting to shift. He noticed the phones, the eyes, the posture of the room changing around him. And for the first time since this began, he hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but it was there, and Ethan saw it, not as a victory, not yet, but as confirmation, because moments like this were never about volume or force, they were about timing, about letting the truth build quietly until it could no longer be ignored, and as the distant sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway behind the front desk, signaling that security had been called and was on the way, the room held its breath again, not in fear this time, but in anticipation, because whatever happened next was no longer going to be controlled by assumptions, it was going to reveal something deeper, something none of them were fully prepared for. The footsteps grew louder, steady and deliberate, echoing across the marble floor as two security officers emerged from the hallway behind the front desk, their presence cutting through the tension like a line drawn in the sand, and for a brief moment the manager regained something that looked like confidence, his shoulders straightening as if reinforcements alone were enough to restore control. "There you go," he said, gesturing toward Ethan Cole with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Handle this." The word simple, but loaded with assumption, because to him this was already decided, already resolved, just a matter of removal, but the room did not respond the same way it had seconds ago. Something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, and now every movement was being watched with a different kind of attention, the kind that questions instead of accepts, the kind that notices details. The first officer slowed slightly as he approached, his eyes moving from the manager to Ethan, then to the surrounding guests, reading the room in a way the manager had failed to do. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked, his tone neutral, professional, not yet aligned with either side, and that question alone disrupted the script, because it required explanation, not just command. The manager did not hesitate, stepping forward quickly, eager to fill the space with his version of events. "He is refusing to leave private property and causing a disturbance," he said, his voice firm, confident, but just a little too quick, like someone trying to stay ahead of doubt. The second officer glanced at Ethan, expecting resistance, expecting agitation, expecting anything that would confirm the claim, but what he saw instead did not match. Ethan Cole stood exactly as he had before, composed, grounded, his expression calm, almost patient, as if time itself was on his side, and that contrast lingered, because reality does not always follow the loudest voice, sometimes it aligns with the quietest presence. "Sir," the first officer said, addressing Ethan directly now, "we are going to need you to step outside while this gets sorted." The request was standard, procedural, designed to de-escalate, but the moment it left his mouth, something in the room tightened again, not with fear, but with expectation, because this was the turning point, the moment where most people would comply, where they would step back, lower their voice, accept the situation even if it was wrong, But Ethan did not move, not out of defiance, not out of stubbornness, but out of certainty, and when he finally spoke again his voice was just as steady as before, just as controlled, but now there was something else beneath it, something sharper, something intentional, sordid, he repeated quietly, letting the word settle, then his eyes shifted, not just to the officer, but to the manager, holding him there for a second longer than necessary. That depends on what you think needs fixing. The sentence was simple, but it carried weight, because it reframed everything. It turned the situation from a removal into a question, and questions have a way of exposing things people would rather keep hidden. The manager's expression tightened again, irritation rising now, because this was not how it was supposed to go. The man in front of him was supposed to fold, to argue, to give him something obvious to push against. But instead he was being forced into a space where his own actions were being examined, and that made him uncomfortable. Do not complicate this, he snapped, his voice cutting through the air again, but it did not land the same way this time, because now the room was listening differently, now every word was being weighed, and Ethan Cole, still unmoved, reached slowly into his pocket, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, pulling out his phone and holding it loosely in his hand, his gaze never leaving the manager as he spoke again. Calm but unmistakably firm. I am not the one complicating anything, he said, and in that moment, without raising his voice, without stepping forward, without doing anything the manager could easily label as a threat, he shifted the balance of the entire room, because now it was no longer about whether he would leave, it was about whether anyone else was ready to face what was about to be revealed. The manager's patience snapped, not loudly, but in the way his tone hardened, like a door closing with finality. Enough, he said, stepping forward again, trying to reclaim the center of the moment. You are not in a position to negotiate anything here, and yet even as he said it, his words felt thinner, less convincing, because the room was no longer responding to him the way it had at the beginning. The shift was subtle but undeniable. The guests were not just watching now, they were evaluating, and the security officers, standing between both men, could feel it too, that invisible weight pressing on every decision. The first officer glanced again at Ethan Cole, then at the manager, then back at Ethan, and something about that calm, that stillness, refused to align with the story he had been given. Sir, he repeated, more carefully this time, if there is a misunderstanding, we can resolve it outside. But Ethan did not step back, did not raise his voice, did not challenge the authority directly. Instead he tilted his head slightly, as if considering the offer, then let his gaze drift across the lobby, taking in the faces, the phones, the quiet tension that had turned the entire space into a living record of what had already happened. You want to resolve it, he said slowly, his voice even, measured, then let us resolve it here. The sentence landed with quiet force, because it removed the option of hiding, of relocating the problem where fewer eyes could see it, and that made the manager uncomfortable in a way he could not mask anymore. That is not how this works, he replied quickly, too quickly, his voice rising just enough to reveal the crack beneath it. But Ethan did not follow the escalation, he stayed exactly where he was, anchored, controlled, his presence now doing more than any argument could, because it forced everyone else to confront the moment as it was, not as it was being described. And then, without rushing, without looking down, he unlocked his phone. The small click, almost inaudible, yet somehow it carried through the silence, drawing attention in a way louder actions never could. His thumb moved once across the screen, deliberate, precise, and he lifted the phone to his ear, not turning away, not stepping aside, just standing there in full view of everyone. Yes, he said, his tone unchanged, calm but unmistakably direct, I need you to pull up the live operations feed for the main lobby. There was a pause, brief, controlled, the kind that suggested the person on the other end did not need further explanation, and around him the tension sharpened, because now there was a second layer to the situation, something unseen beginning to move behind the surface. The manager scoffed under his breath, trying to dismiss it, trying to reduce it to a performance. Who exactly do you think you are calling? He said, a faint edge of uncertainty slipping into his voice despite his effort to sound dismissive, and Ethan answered without looking at him, without breaking the flow of what he had already set in motion. Someone who can see everything that just happened, he said, and that sentence changed the air again, because it introduced something the manager could not control, not with volume, not with authority, not with presence, And the security officers exchanged a quick glance, subtle but meaningful, because now they were no longer just responding to a disturbance, they were standing in the middle of something that was beginning to unfold beyond their usual procedures. The second officer shifted his stance slightly, no longer leaning toward removal, but holding position, waiting, and that hesitation spoke louder than any command, because it signaled that the outcome was no longer certain, that the script had been disrupted beyond repair. And as Ethan lowered the phone just enough to speak again, his eyes finally returning to the manager, there was something different in his expression now, not anger, not satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that comes when a moment reaches its point of no return. "You should have asked one question," he said quietly, his voice steady, almost reflective, "before you decided who I was." And for the first time since this began, the manager had no immediate response, no quick reply to fill the space, because deep down, whether he admitted it or not, he could feel it, something bigger than this moment was about to surface, and there was nothing left he could do to stop it. The manager's silence did not last long, but when he spoke again, something had shifted, not in volume, but in certainty, as if the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as it had been just moments ago. "You are trying to make this into something it is not," he said, forcing a tight smile that did not reach his eyes, but the words no longer carried the same authority, because now the room had context, now there was the idea that something bigger was unfolding, and once that idea enters a space, it cannot be removed, it grows, it spreads, it makes people question what they thought they understood. The woman near the reception desk who had hesitated before now lifted her phone again, this time without lowering it. Her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke to the person next to her, asking who he was, and that question, simple as it was, echoed further than anything the manager had said, because it was no longer about removal, it was about identity, and identity changes everything. The first security officer cleared his throat, his posture no longer rigid with instruction but balanced with caution. "Sir," he said again, this time addressing Ethan Cole with a level of respect that had not been there before, "if there is someone we need to contact, we can assist." But Ethan did not look at him, his focus remained steady, his phone still in hand, the call still active, the quiet presence of someone on the other end now part of the room even if unseen. "You already are assisting," Ethan replied calmly, and that response carried a different kind of weight, because it implied that everything happening now was being noted, recorded, understood in a way that extended beyond the lobby itself. The manager let out a short laugh, but it sounded forced, thin. "This is ridiculous," he said, shaking his head as if trying to dismiss the entire situation. "You think a phone call changes anything," but even as he said it, his eyes flicked briefly toward the security officers, searching for reassurance, for alignment, for someone to restore the structure he had relied on from the beginning, and he did not fully find it, because the officers were no longer acting on assumption, they were observing, waiting, and that pause was dangerous for him, because it gave space for doubt to grow. Ethan finally lowered the phone slightly, just enough to speak more clearly, his voice still calm, still controlled, but now carrying a quiet finality that had not been there before. "It does not change anything," he said, meeting the manager's gaze directly, "it reveals it," and that distinction landed hard, because it reframed the entire moment. It suggested that nothing new was being created here, only exposed, and exposure is something authority cannot easily survive. A faint sound came from behind the front desk then, subtle but sharp enough to draw attention, a notification tone from one of the staff computers, followed by another, then another, like a chain reaction beginning somewhere unseen. The receptionist glanced down at the screen, her expression shifting instantly, confusion first, then something closer to alarm. She leaned toward a colleague, whispering quickly, her eyes darting toward the manager, and for the first time since this began, the manager turned away from Ethan, just slightly, just enough to catch that movement. "What is it?" he asked, irritation creeping into his voice, but the answer did not come immediately, because the staff themselves were trying to understand what they were seeing, lines of text appearing, system alerts updating in real time, something being accessed, something being pulled up that was not part of their normal operations. The second officer noticed it too, his gaze shifting toward the desk, then back to Ethan, the connection forming silently, and the room, already tense, tightened further, because now there was evidence of something happening beyond words, beyond claims, something tangible, something that could not be dismissed with tone or Authority. Ethan returned the phone to his ear for a brief moment, listening, then nodded once, a small movement, but decisive, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, but it carried a certainty that filled the entire space. "Thank you," he said, ending the call, and as the screen behind the desk refreshed once more, the manager felt it, not fully understood, not yet defined, but unmistakable. The moment he had been trying to control was no longer his, it belonged to something else now, something already in motion, and there was no way to stop what was coming next. The faint hum of the system alerts did not stop, it multiplied, layering over itself like a signal no one in the room had been trained to recognize, and that was the moment everything began to tilt, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that the illusion of control could no longer hold. The receptionist's hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to continue or to stop, her eyes scanning lines of information that were not part of her daily routine. Her voice came out low, uncertain. This is not a standard system pull," she said to the colleague beside her, but the words carried just far enough for the manager to hear, and that was enough. He stepped toward the desk quickly, his composure tightening into something sharper, more urgent. "Let me see that," he demanded, leaning over the counter, trying to reclaim authority. Through proximity, through presence, but what he saw did not give him control, it took it away, because the screen was no longer showing reservations, check-ins, or guest profiles, it was showing administrative access logs, executive-level clearance indicators, data that existed above his role, beyond his permissions, and for a brief second his expression faltered, just enough for those watching to notice. The security officers noticed it, the guests noticed it, even the staff who had been silent until now felt the shift ripple through them, because authority that hesitates becomes visible, and once it becomes visible, it can be questioned. "There has to be some mistake," the manager said quickly, straightening up, his voice trying to regain its earlier firmness, but the edge of uncertainty was there now, impossible to hide. The second officer stepped slightly closer to the desk, not intruding, but observing with intent, his gaze moving between the screen and Ethan Cole, the connection no longer abstract, no longer just a possibility, but something forming into clarity, and Ethan, still standing where he had been from the beginning, watched it unfold without interruption, without urgency, because this was the part most people never understood. Power does not rush, it waits until the truth arrives on its own terms. One of the staff members swallowed hard and spoke, her voice careful, almost hesitant. "This level of access, it is linked to ownership credentials," she said, and the words landed heavier than anything that had been said so far, because they did not accuse, they confirmed. The manager turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "That is not possible," he snapped, but the denial came too fast, too defensive, because now he was not correcting a situation, he was reacting to it, and reaction is the first sign of losing control. The first officer shifted his stance again, no longer positioned to escort someone out, but to remain present, to witness, because something had changed, something that required attention rather than action. A man near the entrance spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough to be heard, asking if this meant what he thought it meant, and that question spread through the room like a ripple, each person connecting the same dots at slightly different speeds. The phones that had been recording now held steady, not capturing a conflict, but capturing a reveal in progress. Ethan finally took a step forward, not toward the exit, not toward confrontation, but toward the center of the moment, his presence now impossible to ignore, and when he spoke, his voice did not rise, it did not need to, because the room was already listening. "There is no mistake," he said calmly, his eyes meeting the manager's with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "You just did not recognize what you were looking at," and that sentence settled into the space like a final piece clicking into place, because in that moment, the narrative shifted completely, not through force, not through volume, but through truth, and the manager, standing in the same place where he had once held control, now found himself facing something he could not command, something he could not dismiss, something that was already unfolding beyond him, and the room, once silent in uncertainty, was now silent for a different reason. It was waiting for what came next. For a moment no one spoke, not because they did not have words, but because none of them fit what they were now seeing. The manager stood frozen between the desk and the center of the lobby, his earlier confidence dissolving into something far less stable, his eyes flicking from the screen to Ethan Cole and back again as if repeating the motion might somehow change what it meant. Ownership credentials do not just appear, he said finally, his voice tighter now, less certain, clinging to procedure like it could still protect him, but even that sounded fragile, because the system in front of him was not asking for his approval, it was confirming something already in place, something that had been there long before this moment began. The receptionist stepped back slightly, her hands no longer touching the keyboard, as if the screen itself had become something she was not allowed to interfere with. It is not appearing, she said carefully, her voice steady despite the tension. It has always been here, and that distinction hit harder than any accusation, because it meant the mistake was not in the system, it was in the assumption. The security officers exchanged another glance, longer this time, more deliberate. The first officer straightened slightly, his posture shifting from neutral to respectful without being told, because training can only take you so far. The rest comes from recognizing when a situation changes, and this one had changed completely. The second officer stepped half a pace back, not retreating, but creating space, the kind of space given to someone whose position has just been redefined, and the guests felt it too, the subtle repositioning of power, the way the center of the room moved without anyone physically directing it. The man who had been recording lowered his phone just enough to look directly at Ethan, his expression no longer curious, but understanding, as if the story he thought he was capturing had just become something else entirely. The manager noticed all of it, every shift, every glance, every inch of space that no longer belonged to him, and that awareness made his voice sharper when he spoke again. Even if that were true, he said quickly, forcing the words out before doubt could fully take hold, it does not excuse the disruption. But the argument no longer landed, because it was built on a version of events that was already collapsing. Ethan took another step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to stand where the light from the overhead fixtures caught his face clearly, removing any shadow, any ambiguity, and when he spoke, his voice carried with a clarity that cut through everything else. "You are right," he said, and for a brief second that agreement confused the manager, disrupted his rhythm. "It does not excuse anything," Ethan continued, his gaze steady, unwavering, "it exposes it," and that word again, expose, settled into the room with finality, because now there was no version of this that could be rewritten, no narrative that could be adjusted to fit the original assumption. One of the staff members behind the desk glanced at the main monitor again, then at Ethan, her expression shifting from uncertainty to realization, and she spoke softly, almost to herself, but loud enough for those closest to hear. "His name is listed as primary owner," and that was it, the sentence that turned possibility into fact, that removed any remaining space for denial. The manager's shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightening as if holding back a response that no longer existed, because everything he had said, everything he had done, was now being measured against a reality he had failed to recognize, and in that moment, the room did not need Ethan to announce who he was, it already knew. The truth had arrived without spectacle, without force, just as it always does, quietly and completely, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, heavy with understanding, heavy with consequence, and every person in that lobby could feel it settling into place. The silence did not break with noise, it deepened, settling over the lobby like something final, something that could not be undone, and in that stillness Ethan Cole did not rush to fill it, he let it breathe, let every person in that room sit with what they had just realized, because moments like this were not about proving a point, they were about allowing the truth to land fully, completely, without distraction. And as he stood there, his gaze steady but distant for a brief second, something shifted inside him, not visible to everyone, but real, a quiet pull backward through time, a memory rising uninvited yet perfectly timed. He was younger then, standing in a different lobby, smaller, less polished, but carrying the same weight of expectation, the same unspoken judgment that came before any introduction, before any name. He remembered the way the clerk had looked at him, not with anger, not even with open disrespect, but with dismissal, the kind that did not need to be loud to be clear. "We are fully booked," they had said, without checking, without asking, without seeing him as anything more than what they had already decided he was, and he remembered standing there, holding a reservation confirmation in his hand, feeling the quiet burn of something deeper than frustration, something that did not explode outward, but settled inward, becoming something colder, sharper, more focused. He had left that day without raising his voice, without forcing the moment, but he had carried it with him, not as anger, but as direction, as a reminder that spaces like that were not built to include him, and if he wanted to change that, he would have to build something of his own, something that could not be denied by appearance or assumption. And now, years later, standing in a lobby that carried his vision, his investment, his name, even if no one had recognized it at first, the same pattern had tried to repeat itself, the same assumption had surfaced, but this time it had nowhere to go. Because he was no longer the man being turned away, he was the one who defined the space itself. The memory faded as quickly as it had come, not lingering, not distracting, just reinforcing what was already clear, and when his focus returned fully to the present, the room was still watching, still waiting. The manager had not moved much, but everything about him had changed, his posture tighter, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and calculation, as if trying to find a way out of something that had already closed in around him. The security officers remained where they were, but their stance had shifted completely now, no longer enforcing, only observing, their presence no longer a tool of removal but a witness to what was unfolding. One of the guests spoke softly, almost under their breath, but the words carried, "He owns this place," and that simple statement spread through the room like confirmation of something everyone had already begun to accept. Ethan finally took another step forward, not to confront, not to intimidate, but to stand fully in the reality that had just been revealed, his voice calm, grounded, but now carrying a quiet authority that no longer needed to be hidden. "This is not the first time," he said, not looking at anyone in particular at first, his words directed at the space itself, at the pattern that had played out more times than anyone cared to admit. Then his gaze settled on the manager, steady, unshaken. "The difference is," he continued, his tone even, "this time you did it in a place that answers to me," and that sentence did not rise, did not demand attention, but it held it completely, because it marked the transition from misunderstanding to consequence, from assumption to accountability. And in that moment the lobby was no longer just a setting, it had become proof of how quickly perception can fail, and how quietly power can correct it. The words settled into the room like a verdict that had already been decided, and for a moment the manager did not respond, not because he agreed, but because he could not find a version of reality where he still held control. His eyes moved again toward the screen behind the desk as if hoping it would change, as if the confirmation would disappear if he looked at it long enough, but it did not. It remained there, steady, undeniable, and the longer it stayed, the more it stripped away everything he had relied on just minutes ago. If that is the case," he finally said, his voice no longer sharp, no longer commanding, but uneven, searching for footing that was no longer there, "then there has been a misunderstanding." The word landed differently this time, smaller, almost fragile, because it was no longer a tool to dismiss someone, it was an attempt to protect himself, and the room heard that shift clearly. The guests who had been silent now watched with a different kind of attention, not curiosity, but recognition, because they had seen this pattern before, the moment when certainty collapses into explanation, when authority retreats into apology without ever fully admitting fault. The first security officer straightened further, his tone now measured with respect. "Sir," he said to Ethan Cole, "is there anything you would like us to do?" And that question alone marked the complete reversal of the situation, because it acknowledged where the authority now stood, it acknowledged who the decision belonged to, and Ethan did not answer immediately. He let the question sit, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because moments like this were not about reacting, they were about choosing carefully what came next. The manager noticed it, the pause, the control, and it made him step forward again, though this time there was no dominance in the movement, only urgency. "Look," he said quickly, lowering his voice slightly as if trying to shift the tone, "we can resolve this, whatever you need, we can fix it," but the words felt empty, because they were not rooted in understanding, they were rooted in consequence, and Ethan's gaze remained steady, unmoved by the sudden change in approach. "Fix it," he repeated quietly, and there was no anger in his voice, only clarity. "You think this is about fixing a moment," he continued, his eyes holding the manager in place without raising his voice. "This is about how that moment happened at all," and that distinction cut deeper than any accusation, because it removed the possibility of a quick solution. It pointed to something systemic, something that could not be undone with a single action. One of the staff members behind the desk lowered her head slightly, her expression shifting into something closer to realization, as if understanding that what they had participated in was not just a mistake, but part of a pattern. The manager opened his mouth again, searching for another response, another way to regain control, but nothing came out immediately, because the structure he had relied on had already collapsed, and in its place there was only exposure. The second officer took a small step back, giving more space, not out of retreat, but out of recognition, the kind of recognition that comes when authority is clearly defined without needing to be stated. The guests who had been recording now held their phones steady, not capturing conflict, but witnessing accountability, and in the center of it all Ethan Cole stood exactly as he had from the beginning, calm, grounded, unchanged, except now the room understood why, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried the same quiet control that had guided every word before it. "You told me I did not belong here," he said, not raising his tone, not adding emphasis, just stating it as fact. "You decided that before you knew anything else." He paused briefly, not for effect, but to let the truth settle fully, then continued, "That is not a misunderstanding," and the sentence landed with finality, because it removed the last layer of denial, leaving only the reality of what had been done, and in that moment, no one in the room was waiting for an explanation anymore. They were waiting for what would come after it. The room did not rush to fill the silence that followed, it held it, as if everyone understood that whatever came next would define everything that had just unfolded, and Ethan Cole did not move immediately. He let the weight of his last words settle fully, because truth, when it is finally seen, does not need to be repeated, it needs to be absorbed. The manager stood there, his posture no longer rigid with authority but strained with realization, his hands no longer steady, his voice caught somewhere between defense and retreat. "I did not mean it like that," he said finally, but even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded, because meaning was no longer the issue, impact was, and the room knew it, the staff knew it, even the security officers, who now stood quietly to the side, understood that this moment had moved far beyond procedure. Ethan's gaze did not waver. Not out of anger, but out of clarity, the kind that comes when a situation reveals itself completely. "It is never meant like that," he said calmly, his tone even, controlled. "That is why it keeps happening," and those words landed deeper than anything before, because they pointed beyond the lobby, beyond this single moment, to something larger, something repeated, something normalized. The manager looked down briefly, then back up, searching for something to say that could undo what had already been exposed, but there was nothing left to reach for, because the structure he had relied on was gone, replaced by something he could not navigate. One of the staff members behind the desk took a small step forward, her voice hesitant but sincere. "We should have asked," she said quietly, and that simple admission shifted the tone again, because it was the first moment of accountability that did not come from pressure, but from understanding. Ethan glanced toward her, not with judgment, but with acknowledgement, because recognition is where change begins, but it does not erase what came before it. The manager inhaled slowly, as if preparing to speak again, but when he did, the words were softer, stripped of their earlier certainty. "What do you want us to do?" he asked, and the question was no longer about control, it was about consequence, the kind that cannot be avoided once the truth is clear. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked around the lobby, at the guests who had witnessed everything, at the staff who were now standing in a different kind of silence, at the security officers who had shifted from enforcement to observation, and in that moment, the entire space felt different, not because of what had happened, but because of what had been revealed. He took a slow breath, steady, measured, then returned his gaze to the manager. "You already did what you chose to do," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Now it is my turn," and the sentence carried a quiet finality that left no room for misinterpretation, because it marked the transition from exposure to action, from understanding to consequence. The manager's expression tightened again, not in defiance, but in anticipation of what that meant. The staff behind the desk exchanged glances, the weight of the moment settling into something real, something immediate. Ethan reached into his pocket once more, pulling out his phone, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, the same way he had done everything since the beginning, and as he unlocked it, the room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because this time, they knew exactly what that small action represented, not a question, not a call for help, but a decision. And when he lifted the phone to his ear, his voice remained steady, controlled, unmistakably clear. Initiate executive review, he said, and the words, simple as they were, carried the weight of everything that had just happened, because they were not about reacting to a moment, they were about responding to a pattern, and in that instant, everyone in the lobby understood that what came next would not be temporary, it would be permanent. The moment the call ended, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted again, but this time it was not subtle, it was structural, like something deep within the building itself had been activated, the system behind the front desk refreshed once more, but now the change was visible to everyone, not just the staff. Screens flickered, access panels updated, and a quiet tone echoed from multiple terminals at once. The kind of sound that usually meant authority had just moved from one level to another. The receptionist stepped back instinctively, her voice barely above a whisper. Executive override confirmed, she said, and those words did not need explanation, because everyone in the room could feel what they meant. The manager's face lost the last trace of control he had been holding on to, his posture stiffening not with authority, but with realization. Wait, he said quickly, stepping forward, his voice no longer measured, no longer composed. This is not necessary, we can handle this internally, but the sentence fell apart as soon as it left his mouth, because internal no longer applied. This had already moved beyond him, beyond the lobby, beyond anything he could contain. Ethan Cole did not respond immediately, he simply watched, his expression calm, unchanged, as if everything unfolding was exactly as it should be, because for him, it was not escalation, it was alignment. The first security officer straightened fully now, his stance no longer neutral, but respectful. Deliberate, sir, he said to Ethan, his tone clear, we are standing by for your direction. And that sentence echoed louder than anything before it, because it marked the complete reversal of power. The same presence that had been called to remove him was now waiting for his instruction. The guests felt it, the staff felt it, even the manager could not ignore it, his eyes darting around the room, searching for something, anything that still belonged to him, but there was nothing left. The system behind the desk displayed new prompts, access restrictions updating in real time, and then came the final confirmation, a line of text that appeared across the main monitor, clear, undeniable, executive authority active, and beneath it, a name, Ethan Cole. The room did not react with noise, it reacted with stillness, the kind that comes when something undeniable replaces everything that came before it. The manager's voice dropped, almost unrecognizable now. You could have said something, he muttered. As if that alone could have changed the outcome, as if the responsibility could somehow be shifted back, but Ethan's gaze held steady, and when he spoke, his voice carried no anger, no need to prove anything, only truth. I should not have to announce my value to be treated with basic respect, he said, and the sentence landed heavier than any command could have, because it stripped the situation down to its core, removing titles, removing roles, leaving only the reality of what had been done. The staff behind the desk lowered their eyes, the weight of that truth settling in. One of them exhaled slowly, as if understanding something they had not seen before. The manager tried to respond, but the words did not come, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend. The moment had moved beyond explanation, beyond justification, and into consequence. Ethan took a single step forward, not to dominate the space, but to stand fully in it, his presence now undeniable in every sense. You did not fail because you did not know who I was, he said, his tone calm but firm. You failed because of how you treated someone you thought did not matter, and that sentence sealed everything, because it made the reveal irrelevant, it made the power secondary to the principle, and in that moment, every person in the lobby understood that what was about to happen next was not about status. It was about accountability, and there was no system, no title, no position that could shield anyone from that. No one moved at first, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that whatever came next would not be reversed. The system had already shifted, the authority had already been defined, and now it was only a matter of action. Ethan Cole stood at the center of it all, calm, composed, as if the weight of the moment rested lightly on him, not because it was small, but because he had carried heavier things before. His gaze moved briefly across the staff behind the desk, not scanning them as individuals, but seeing them as part of something larger, a system that had allowed this moment to happen in the first place. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, it did not need to, because every person in that lobby was already listening. This is not about one decision, he said, steady and clear, it is about a pattern that should not exist here, and those words shifted the focus again. Away from a single action and toward the structure behind it, the manager opened his mouth slightly, as if to interrupt, but stopped himself, because there was nothing left to interrupt with, no argument that could stand against what had already been confirmed. The first security officer remained still, his posture now fully aligned with Ethan, not in submission, but in recognition, because authority, when real, does not need to be enforced, it is understood. The staff behind the desk exchanged glances, not out of confusion, but out of awareness, as if they were beginning to see the full scope of what this moment represented. Ethan took a slow breath, not to steady himself, but to mark the transition from acknowledgement to consequence, and then he spoke again, each word deliberate, each sentence carrying the weight of decision. Effective immediately, he said. His tone calm but absolute. The current management of this location is relieved of duty pending full review. The sentence did not echo loudly, but it landed deeply, because it was final, because it was real, because it was happening in front of them, not as a distant policy, but as a present action. The manager's face drained of the last remnants of certainty, his posture shifting as if the ground beneath him had changed. "You cannot just do that," he said, but the protest lacked force. Lacked conviction, because even he knew that it was no longer true. Ethan did not respond with volume, did not raise his voice, he simply held his gaze steady and said, "I already did," and that quiet certainty carried more weight than any argument ever could. The system behind the desk updated again, access privileges changing in real time, badges losing clearance, authority transferring instantly from one level to another. The receptionist stepped back completely now, her role no longer defined by the person who had stood in front of her minutes ago, but by the system that had just redefined everything. The guests who had been watching let out quiet breaths, the tension shifting into something else, not relief exactly, but resolution, because they had witnessed the full arc of the moment, from assumption to consequence. One of them nodded slowly, almost to themselves, as if acknowledging that what they had just seen mattered beyond this space. The second officer spoke quietly, his tone respectful, "Do you require any further assistance, sir?" And the question now carried a different meaning, not enforcement, but support. Ethan glanced briefly toward him, then back to the room. "Ensure the staff are treated professionally during the transition," he said, his voice steady, because accountability did not require humiliation, it required action. The staff behind the desk straightened slightly, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because even in consequence, there was structure, there was dignity. The manager stood still, his earlier authority gone, replaced by the reality of what had just happened, and in the center of it all, Ethan Cole remained exactly who he had been from the beginning, not louder, not harsher, just clearer. And as the system completed its update, as the room adjusted to its new reality, one thing became undeniable to everyone present. This was not a moment of power. It was a moment of truth, and truth, once revealed, does not need to shout to be heard. The lobby did not return to normal, not immediately, because moments like this do not end with a sound, they settle, they reshape everything quietly. And as the system finalized its updates and the staff adjusted to their new positions, Ethan Cole remained still for a moment longer, not because he needed to stay, but because he understood that the final impression of a moment carries more weight than the first. The manager stood off to the side now, no longer at the center, his earlier certainty replaced by something far more human, reflection, realization, the kind that arrives too late to prevent consequences but just in time to understand them. The guests who had witnessed everything slowly began to shift, some lowering their phones, others exchanging quiet words, not loud, not celebratory, but thoughtful, because what they had seen was not just a reversal of power, it was a correction of something deeper, something that extended beyond a single interaction. The first security officer stepped slightly forward, his tone respectful, steady. "Sir, everything is being handled as directed," he said, and Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging the update without needing more detail, because the outcome had already been set in motion. He glanced once more toward the front desk, where the staff now moved with a different awareness, a different understanding of the space they were part of, and for a brief second, the tension that had defined the entire moment seemed to dissolve into something quieter, something more grounded. Ethan took a slow breath, then turned slightly, preparing to leave, not with urgency, not with any need to linger, because his presence had already done what it needed to do. But before he stepped away completely, he paused, just enough to speak one final time, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a clarity that filled the entire room without effort. "Respect should never depend on recognition," he said, not directing the words at one person, but at everyone, because the moment it does, it stops being respect, and that sentence settled into the space like a closing note, not loud, not dramatic, but complete, the kind of statement that does not need repetition because it stays with you. The manager lowered his gaze slightly, not in shame alone, but in understanding, because for the first time, he could see the moment for what it truly was, not a disruption, not a misunderstanding, but a failure of perception, a failure of judgment, and that realization carried more weight than any punishment could. Ethan did not wait for a response, did not look for acknowledgement, because he did not need it. The truth had already been seen, and that was enough. He walked toward the exit with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning, his step steady, unhurried, as if the building itself now moved around him differently, not because it had changed, but because it had been revealed. The doors opened, the outside light spilling in briefly, and as he stepped through, the lobby behind him remained still for a moment longer, holding on to what had just happened, holding on to the shift that could not be undone, and then, slowly, life resumed, conversations returned, movement continued, but something had changed, something subtle but lasting, because every person who had been there would carry that moment with them, not as a story of power, but as a reminder, that dignity is not something granted by appearance, by status, or by recognition. It is something that must be given freely, consistently, to everyone, and in the quiet that followed his departure, that truth remained, steady, undeniable, and far more powerful than anything that had been said before.